Hey guys, so today we're starting the second unit. The first half of this unit is just more ecosystem stuff. It actually is fairly closely tied to some of the stuff that we did in the previous unit. And then the second half of this unit is all about evolution. Okay, so let's review some stuff about ecosystems and niches. We're once again going to define terms like population, community, and ecosystem. Species and ecotone might be new to you, and I think we've already talked about biodiversity as well. Then we're going to compare and contrast niches, and then lastly look at the relationship between niches and competition when it comes to native species and invasive species. So let's start with some definitions. Ecology is the study of the interaction between organisms and their living and non-living environment. So that includes their interactions between living things like plants and bacteria and non-living things like the soil and the air and stuff like that. Ecosystem is all of the individuals of all of the species in a habitat, as well as their environment, including both the physical and chemical parts of their environment. Biotic and abiotic factors are the living and non-living factors, respectively, that affect an organism. So biotic factors include things like bacteria, plants, animals. Abiotic factors include things like humidity and insulation levels and pH and stuff like that. Population is all of the individuals of the same species in the same time and place. And then community is all of the different populations, so all of the different species that are in that habitat. So in the previous unit, we kind of talked about how like an organism is the most specific, and then you kind of zoom out to population, which is still all one species, but now multiple organisms. And then you zoom out further to community, which is all of the different populations of all of the different species. And then you zoom out even further to the ecosystem, which is all of that community plus all of the environment that is surrounding that community. A species is an organism that is able to breed with another organism. So essentially, you can tell that two things are the same species if they can breed with one another and produce fertile offspring, so produce children that are also able to reproduce. Individuals of the same species often look alike, but not always. And individuals of different species can also look alike. So that is why we cannot just identify species based on morphology or how they look. You have to use other things. Now that we have the technology, genetics is actually a really great way to identify if two different organisms are the same species or not. Essentially, the more closely related their DNA are, the more likely they are the same species. And then biodiversity is just the measure of the number of different species in an area. So the number of individuals doesn't matter in terms of biodiversity, just the number of different species. An ecotone is the transition area between ecosystems. So two different ecosystems don't really have like a distinct boundary line the way you might have like, the boundary between two countries. They tend to just change gradually from like a grassland to a forest ecosystem or something. And areas where that transition occurs is the ecotone, and that ecotone tends to have characteristics from both ecosystems on either side of it, and because of that, it tends to have higher levels of biodiversity. Because there are like organisms that live in the forest and organisms that live in the grassland that can both live in the ecotone. And then of course, that higher level of biodiversity means that ecotones are more stable because they're more likely able to maintain their dynamic equilibrium. A niche is an organism's role in an ecosystem, so it includes things like its place in the food web, like what trophic level it is, its habitat, how it breeds, where and when in the ecosystem it's active, its predators, its prey, anything that's related to its survival and its reproduction, as well as all of its functions in that ecosystem, are all the niche. Sometimes it's called the ecological niche, but we just kind of shorten it to niche for short. Usually each species in an ecosystem will have a unique niche. There can and likely is overlapping niches, but they're probably not going to be the exact same as each other. There will be some overlap, but not complete overlap between the niches. Having unique niches is important because it will reduce the competition between different species. If two different species had the exact same niche, they would be competing for everything, every single resource they wanted to access, whether it be food or water or shelter, they would have to compete for. So by making the niches unique to one another, it reduces that interspecific competition. However, you do want some overlap because of the insurance effect that we talked about in terms of dynamic equilibrium and the stability of ecosystems. Species will have different adaptations to best suit their unique niche. If you did end up with two different species with the exact same niche, the level of competition would be so high between those different species, one would outcompete the other, usually to the point that one of them goes extinct in that area. This complete overlap of niches usually doesn't happen naturally, but it can happen when you have an invasive species. So an invasive species is when a species comes from a different area, enters that ecosystem, usually because humans either intentionally or accidentally brought them there. And then that invasive species can start to like outcompete the native species because their niches can overlap so much that the invasive species will just like kill off or outcompete the native species. So yeah, an invasive species is a species that's not native to the area. It was introduced to that area by humans, and it causes harm to the new area or to native species in that area. It is the second largest cause of extinction and biodiversity loss, right behind habitat destruction. And like I said, invasive species do tend to outcompete the native species. They don't have any natural predators once they're introduced to a new area. So they don't really have anything keeping their population in check. So because of that, they tend to be able to outcompete native species for resources, which means that the native species like starve to death, or like if it's a plant, can't access the nutrients or the sunlight or something like that. These are three different examples of invasive species that we have here in Canada. This is purple loosestrife, an invasive plant species that was brought over because people thought it looked pretty. This is a sea lamprey, which are found in oceans and stuff like that. They latch on with, this is their mouth, by the way, they latch on to like the sides of fish and take big like circular chunks out of them. And this one here are zebra mussels, which are really common in some lakes and they spread really easily. They're the main reason why people are asked to like wash down your boat when you're like bringing it from one body of water to another so we don't spread these guys. But all of these zebra mussels are actually attached to the outside of a larger native mussel. And because mussels are filter feeders, all of those zebra mussels around the outside are like filtering the water as it comes inwards and taking all of the food out of the water. And then by the time the water gets past all of them to the native mussel, there's no food left in the water, so they starve. Okay, that is an activity that I may or may not assign, so don't worry about that for now. Okay, so that is it for today's lesson. It was a nice, sweet, short one. Tomorrow's lesson, we're going to continue talking about ecosystems.